This video is on the pancreas. And your pancreas has two main functions. It has an endocrine function and an exocrine function. Endocrine means it releases things into the bloodstream. And your pancreas's endocrine function is releasing things into the bloodstream, hormones into the bloodstreams that control our blood sugar. These are hormones like insulin, things like glucagon. Exocrine means releasing things into epithelium, not the blood. This will release things into the epithelium of your duodenum, like digestive enzymes, like fluid, things that help us digest food. That is the exocrine part of your pancreatic function. In this video, we're going to talk about the endocrine only. So we're going to talk about the hormones that you release into your blood to control your blood sugar. You see, in your pancreas, let me draw your pancreas. In your pancreas, you have these clusters of endocrine cells. Clusters of endocrine cells. We sometimes call them islets of Langerhans. Islets meaning island, Langerhans after the person that discovered it. So these little islands of endocrine cells that release the hormones that control our blood sugar. And if we blow this up, if we magnify this, then on the peripheries, you're going to have these cells called alpha cells. Alpha cells. And these alpha cells, like I said, are on the peripheries, and they release a hormone called glucagon. In the center, on the inside, you're going to have something called the beta cells. Beta cells. So right, it's inside, and these release something called insulin. You can remember insulin is inside the islet. And then kind of interspersed all over the place, you have these cells called the delta cells. And these release somatostatin. A quick rundown, just a quick and dirty description of what these hormones do. When I eat a big meal and I digest it and break it down and release all that sugar into my bloodstream, so I got a ton of sugar in my bloodstream, then high blood sugar will trigger insulin release. And insulin will work on cells to suck up all that blood sugar, store it, use it, release insulin to lower your blood sugar, use it up. So I ate my big meal, I released that blood sugar, and insulin is now working to reduce that level of blood sugar. And now I haven't eaten in a long time. I haven't eaten in 8 hours, right? So I'm very, very hungry. I have no more blood sugar left in my blood. That's not good. What if I need to do something? What if I need to run or do something active? I need some blood sugar in my blood, don't I? That's where glucagon comes in. So on low blood sugar, glucagon comes in. And glucagon breaks down storage. So things like glycogen, things like fat. And these release things, fuel, like glycogen. You break down glycogen, you release glucose into your blood. And so raise blood sugar. And then you have your blood sugar to do whatever you need to do. So these two things, insulin and glucagon, are like mortal enemies. Insulin sucks up blood sugar, lowers it. Glucagon raises blood sugar. So they're constantly battling. Yeah, they're like mortal enemies. And a key thing you need to know is that if you have low insulin, you have high glucagon. If you have high glucagon, low insulin. Low glucagon, high insulin. If you have low one thing, you'll have high another. That's insulin, that's glucagon. What does somatostatin do? Somatostatin regulates both of them. It will decrease both if necessary. I always think of like insulin and glucagon like two bickering siblings in the back of a car because they're mortal enemies, so they're always arguing. And then somatostatin is like the mom in the driver's seat that shuts them up. All right, so somatostatin decreases both. And that is the quick and dirty of what your pancreatic endocrine function is. Now in this video, we're going to talk about insulin. This video is going to be all about insulin. What does insulin do again? You have blood sugar. Insulin will lower it, suck it up into your cells, and store it or use it. Okay, that's it. That's what insulin does. And we're going to talk all about that. We're going to see how it does that. And we'll start from the beginning. So we eat a big meal. We eat a big meal. And you break it down into all your sugars, all your saccharides. And you know that you can have monosaccharides. Those are your simplest sugars. But you can also chain those monosaccharides into polysaccharides. Polysaccharides. So you have all these floating around into your gut. Now monosaccharides we can absorb right away. Polysaccharides we have to kind of break down. And things that break it down include things like alpha glucosidase. So that'll break the sugar down, and that sugar will move around into the intestines and get transported by transporters, glucose transporters. If you recall, we have two different types of glucose transporters. We have sodium dependent glucose transporters, aka SGLT, and there are different subtypes. SGLT1 is found in the gut, SGLT2 is found in the gut and also in the kidneys. So SGLT1 and 2, which is found in the kidneys, especially the proximal convoluted tubule. And then of course you have your other subtype of glucose transporter called your glucose transporter. Sometimes we just call them GLUT. All right, and that takes your sugar where it needs to go. And it can take that sugar to your pancreas. That's the money. That's what we need. That's where we need it to go. So it goes to your pancreas. In particular, the beta cell of your pancreas, because your beta cells make insulin, and that's the name of the story. So the beta cells. And your beta cells of your pancreas have insulin. All right? And just like any cells that release things, I mean, all cells that release things do it in the same mechanism. They feel a depolarization and they open up a calcium channel, and that calcium influx causes the vesicles to release. That's not unique to beta cells. All cells that release things do that. And this is no different. So it fills a dipole, calcium influxes, releases insulin. But however, we don't want to just release insulin willy-nilly, otherwise we'll take up all our blood sugar, be hypoglycemic and die. So we have like a stopper in these beta cells, and that is this potassium channel. So in normal resting levels, potassium constantly leaves the beta cell and hyperpolarizes the cell, stops it from depolarizing, stops it from releasing insulin so we don't go into hypoglycemia and die. So at normal levels, it'll kind of keep it low. All right, so back to what we're talking about. You ate a big meal, you broke down all the sugar, and that sugar goes into your beta cells. And that sugar will go into your beta cells through a GLUT transporter, in particular GLUT2. Very important, you know that? So it'll go into there and make GLUT2. And that sugar will turn into ATP via glycolysis, and that ATP will block your potassium channel. By blocking your potassium channel, is no longer hyperpolarized. You can feel that depolarization. Calcium can influx and release your insulin. Hooray! We did it. It releases your insulin. Now just a side note, how is insulin made in the first place? Well, insulin is made by your rough endoplasmic reticulum of your beta cells. It's a rough endoplasmic reticulum, and it's actually made as preproinsulin. Yes, that's two prefixes. That means you have to cleave it twice to make your insulin, and that's exactly what we do. We cleave the first part, the pre part, and just leave proinsulin. And once we make proinsulin, that will travel into the actual vesicles. So the thing that's in your vesicle is actually proinsulin. And then when it's ready to be released, we cleave that final part. And that part becomes something called C-peptide. And then the insulin part becomes your insulin part. And that's what gets released, all right? So you not only release insulin, but you also release C-peptide. All right, what's the importance of that? Let's say a patient comes in super hypoglycemic lethargy, they're about to die, and their insulin levels are off the charts. Their insulin levels are so high. How do you know, how can you find out why their insulin level is so high? Is it insulinoma? Did they OD on their insulin? How do you know? Well, if it's an insulinoma, that means they're producing a ton of insulin. That would mean you have a ton of insulin being released. So you have a ton of insulin, and you also have a ton of C-peptide, because that's what insulin is made out of. That's the precursor. But if they OD'd on insulin, exogenous insulin, the insulin we synthesize, put it in a vial and inject, that insulin doesn't have C-peptide. That insulin is just insulin. Yeah. So if a patient comes in hypoglycemic, insulin's off the charts, you want to measure their C-peptides. If there's no C-peptide there, then they just OD'd on their insulin. If there is C-peptide there, then something's causing normal insulin release to be released at a high rate. Okay, just something you should know. All right, very important. I've seen a couple questions on it. So you release your insulin and your C-peptide. That's not the only thing that gets released with insulin. You also release other things that help insulin. We'll call that insulin helpers. And your insulin helpers include things like amylin. Amylin is co-produced with insulin, though both released at the same time. Amylin helps suppress glucagon, our mortal enemy. It also helps your stomach slow down. All right, stop gastric release. And that way you have time to work on the food that you're working on. So amylin helps insulin. It's our insulin helper buddy. However, there's a problem. Amylin sounds a lot like amyloid, doesn't it? And if you have too much amylin, then it can become amyloid. So just be careful about that. Amyloid. Another insulin helper is glucagon-like peptide. The reason it's called glucagon-like peptide is because it comes from the same gene as glucagon. All right, it's not glucagon. Glucagon's our mortal enemy. We don't want glucagon. The reason why it's called that is because it comes from the same gene. So glucagon-like peptide, aka GLP, will do the same thing as amylin, suppress glucagon, and also delay gastric emptying. Another helper buddy is gastric inhibitory peptide. And you can judge by the name, it inhibits your gastric emptying. Like we said, it gives us more time to work on the food that we're working on currently. Sometimes these are grouped together as incretins. All right. And after it's done its thing, then incretins will get broken down by something called DPP4, dipeptyl peptidase 4. So all right, breaks down your incretins after it's done its job. Yeah, you don't want them to be floating out forever, right? So DPP4 breaks it down after it's done its job. One last thing that you should know, these are released by your GIT when glucose hits your GIT. So they might ask you, what elicits a stronger insulin response? IV glucose or eating glucose? Drinking glucose, whatever. It'd be oral glucose. Because if you do IV glucose, then it bypasses your GIT, never releases these insulin helpers. Yeah? But if you do oral glucose, then it hits your GIT, releases these insulin helpers, elicits a stronger insulin effect. So I write that down. Oral glucose over IV, stronger insulin effect. Due to your insulin helper buddies. Yay. Teamwork makes everything better. What do you think I was gonna say? All right, so you have your insulin getting released. How does it function? How does it intake glucose? How does it suck up glucose? Let's talk about that. Shout out to GMM. So insulin function, it will bind to cells, especially these insulin receptors, which are tyrosine kinase receptors. So I write tyrosine kinase tyrosine kinase. And their main function is to uptake glucose. So right, increase glucose uptake. And to increase cell growth, increase cell storage, store excess sugar for a rainy day. So cell growth, storage, cell growth, and make things like lipids and glycogen for storage. Yeah? Any questions there? How does it do that? Well, insulin will bind to these tyrosine kinase receptors and cause phosphorylation of proteins, and that causes a cascade, cell signaling, all this good biochem stuff. But what you need to know is that cell signaling will cause GLUT4 receptors to be expressed. And those GLUT4 receptors will start to be made and migrate up to the surface, GLUT4. And by having those GLUT4 receptors, it can uptake glucose. Yay! We get glucose into our cell. Glucose. So that's the increased glucose uptake part. How about the cell growth, lipid, glycogen, all that stuff? When it binds to your tyrosine kinase receptors, causes phosphorylation protein, secondary cascade, all that stuff. It can work on different pathways like your MAP kinase pathway, like your P1,3K pathway. Not really important that you know how it works on this pathway, more important that you know how to recognize it on a multiple choice question stem. So if you're able to recognize it on an answer choices, MAP kinase and P1,3K, I think you're in good shape. And these will cause cell growth, these will cause you to make lipids, these will cause you to make glycogen, make those storage. Yeah? So both of these cause cell growth. P1,3K also seems to really help with the synthesis of the storages, so glycogen and lipids. Glycogen, lipid. Good? Good. So just a side note, we said insulin comes in, creates GLUT4, and GLUT4 receptors move up to the cell and take glucose. Now, do all your GLUT receptors need a signal from insulin to go to the surface of your cells? No. In fact, GLUT4 is probably the only one. So we call that insulin-dependent GLUT. And that'd be GLUT4. GLUT4 is dependent on insulin signaling to be made. And GLUT4 is found a lot in your adipose. More importantly, it's found a lot in your striated muscles. Your muscles. That's very important. See? If you're making GLUT4 to take up glucose, yeah, and you're in your muscle and you exercise a lot, let's say you exercise a lot, then you will need more sugar. You will need more fuel, you need more energy. And if you exercise a lot, then you'll actually upregulate GLUT4 because you need to take in, suck in as much fuel, as much glucose as possible. So exercise actually upregulates GLUT4. Very important you keep that in mind. We'll talk about why that's important in a second. So that's your insulin-dependent GLUT transport. That's a GLUT transport that needs insulin signaling to be made. But all the other GLUTs don't need it. We call those insulin-independent. Independent GLUTs. These include things like GLUT1. GLUT1 is seen in your RBCs, your red blood cells, and your blood-brain barrier. GLUT2 is found in your beta cells. GLUT2, right there, beta cells. Your liver, your kidneys. 3 is found in your brain. 5 is a special one that you should never, ever, ever, ever forget. 5 also takes in fructose. You should also never forget that it's seen in sperm. So sperm uses fructose for its fuel to swim around, and it uses fructose, uses GLUT5. Never ever forget that. Seen a lot of questions on that. It's a very unique one. And anytime there's something unique, gotta know. All right, good. So we talked about how you eat a big meal, you have a ton of sugar, that sugar goes to your pancreas, releases insulin, and insulin elicits its effect, right? Takes in all that sugar. So now you have decreased sugar, and any excess sugar will eventually go into your bloodstream, go into your kidneys. So that's our final step. And that sugar will go into your kidneys, into your nephrons, your proximal convoluted tubule. And because sugar is a valuable commodity, sometimes we want to reuptake it. Yeah, reabsorb it. How do we reabsorb it? What's the transporter in your kidneys? That'd be SGLT2. Hope you didn't forget that. We just talked about it 10 minutes ago. SGLT2 will reuptake it, get it back up into your body because it's a valuable commodity. And that is a process of sugar. That's the process of insulin. Hope that clarifies some things. All right, I'm gonna clear the board. Does insulin always elicit the same effect every single time? No, it doesn't. Sometimes it elicits a weaker effect. What causes that? It seems that people that are overweight, people that live a sedentary lifestyle, insulin doesn't cause the same effect. Let's see if we can figure out why. So we have our cell, we have our GLUT4 receptors that we said takes up sugar. Yeah. If you eat a ton, and you have a ton of sugar, ton of fat, ton of storages already, then your body's gonna say, I don't want to take it anymore. I don't need anymore. And it'll start to downregulate these. Downregulate these receptors. So insulin won't have the same effect. Yeah, you'll have less effect. Every time you buy insulin, you'll just make less GLUT receptors. So that's the overeating part. How about the sedentary lifestyle part? Didn't I say exercise upregulates your GLUT4 because you need more fuel, so you upregulate GLUT4? Well, if you're sedentary, then you don't need more fuel. So you downregulate GLUT4. All right, downregulate that. So this later part of our pathway is broken. Yeah, insulin binds, but it doesn't make a lot of GLUT4 because it doesn't need to make a lot of GLUT4. So that part of our pathway is broken. All right, so we have a lot of sugar. However, is there anything wrong with our release of insulin? No, you still release the same amount of insulin. So you have a lot of sugar, hyperglycemia, but you have a lot of insulin too. Increased insulin. That's like a contradiction. If you have increased insulin, shouldn't that suck up sugar? So if you have increased insulin that's not doing its job, not eliciting the same effect, we call that insulin resistant. Your body's resistant to insulin. Yeah, insulin resistant. Very important concept you should know. And that leads us to our next topic, and that is the topic of diabetes. Diabetes is high blood sugar. Something's gone wrong, and now you have high blood sugar. That's all. That's diabetes. That's it. That's high blood sugar. And that high blood sugar causes all the manifestations of diabetes. The blindness, the retinopathy, the nephropathy, the chronic kidney disease, the peripheral neuropathy where you can't feel your foot. You get ulcers, you can get it amputated. All that comes from high blood sugar. That's it. That's diabetes. You control that blood sugar, it's like you don't have diabetes. All right, so it's all due to high blood sugar. Now there are other causes of high blood sugar besides our whole insulin pathway. I mean, you can have hormones like epi and cortisol. These are stress hormones. These break down glycogen and release sugar, so you get high blood sugar. That way you're in stress, right? You need to do something, so you have sugar to work on that. And then you can also have hormones like growth hormones, things that control your growth and your metabolic rate, that also breaks down glycogen, so you have enough sugar to grow. So those things can cause high blood sugar, but in this video we're going to talk about high blood sugar due to diabetes, due to something wrong with our insulin. That's our thing that controls blood sugar. Yeah? So if something's wrong with our insulin, we have high blood sugar, diabetes. What can go wrong? Well, you can have not enough insulin. If you don't have enough insulin, then you can't suck in the sugar, you get high blood sugar. That's called type 1 diabetes. Or you can have insulin that doesn't work. Insulin resistance. We just talked about that. So you have good insulin, you have enough insulin, it just doesn't work. And those are our main types. Now,